Hi, everybody. I'm Lavonde. I'm head of governance at the Optimism Foundation. The Optimism Foundation has been developing the governance system for optimism over the past 4 years, meaning we've run a bunch of experiments to try to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and what we think needs to change in order to support crypto's next wave of adoption. At this point, I think we can say that most of the original hypotheses around DAOs have not played out the way that we thought they would. And now we're kind of left with the product of an outdated regulatory environment. And so a lot of people have become disillusioned with DAOs. I think it's fair to say that if we started from scratch today, we would not move forward with the design that we currently have. But governance is still really important, especially to support the next wave of enterprise adoption in the case of Optimism. So we went back to the drawing board and said, what if we just copied what corporate governance does? What changes would we want to make to that model, and what would that mean for how Web3 governance looks? So a lot of people are disillusioned with DAOs right now. That term has come to mean a treasury controlled by token-weighted voting. And we have enough data at this point, and there's enough history to support that that model doesn't work very well. At least we can say we wouldn't probably move forward with a model designed that way if we started from scratch today. But we still need DAOs, and I'm going to outline some of the reasons why we think Web3 governance is still important. But as Vitalik outlined a few weeks ago, we need different DAOs or better DAOs. And so we're going to look to the long history of corporate governance to see what different and better might look like. That's what that's like. So why is it still important to have Web3 governance or DAOs or some different word to describe that thing? And it's because protocols need to exist into perpetuity. If Optimism is building the world's supercomputer, or if any other protocol is doing that, it can't crash out in 5 years. And so there's two value propositions that we think Web3 governance can kind of incorporate that are weaknesses of Web 2 governance. And this is why we think it's still really important that governance exists. And those are that governance over the protocol can reduce platform risk. And platform risk is a problem in Web 2. And it is the risk that a platform, in our case, the OP stack, changes against the interests of the stakeholders that rely on that platform. And there's practical examples of this. The second value proposition is that governance can prevent enshittification, which is in the dictionary, but is a word that describes the phenomenon of the product getting worse over time as profits are over-extracted to investors and under-invested in R&D. And so we think that governance over the treasury can prevent enshittification, which should lead to a better product and a more sustainable business over time. The issue is that what DAOs currently look like today is a lot of bureaucracy with very little benefit and a bunch of other chaos. So originally, we thought the benefits of DAOs would include things like wisdom of the crowds resulting in better decision-making, or plurality allowing us to enable the optimal approach or the optimal path, and external contributions allowing us to innovate faster. In practice, there's very few examples of any of these playing out. Instead, what we see most of the time is mismanagement of the treasury, stagnation, directionlessness, stakeholder capture by various different stakeholders, and misaligned participants. All of that results in undermined legitimacy for the governance system that usually results in the kind of supporting organization, whether that's labs or a foundation or some version of that, re-centralizing everything. And then we have what's referred to as decentralization theater, which is when you have all the downsides of decentralization because you're pretending to be decentralized without any of the benefits because you're pretending to be decentralized. So how do we move away from this model that we're kind of all currently operating in? And our approach was to look at corporate governance as a sort of base case. What I'm going to describe refers to the US model of corporate governance. There are other models, but this is the main one that we looked at. And that model is simple and pretty solid. At a high level, you could describe it as saying shareholders vote on issues that impact their ownership or structural changes. So how much of the company they own or what they own. They also typically elect or remove the board of directors who also in turn kind of hire and fire management or the CEO. They can submit shareholder proposals occasionally on other topics. It usually happens once a year at an annual meeting. It's usually within a pretty well-defined scope, and they're usually non-binding. The board of directors is the main mechanism that holds management accountable. Decisions are optimized for shareholder primacy and maximization of shareholder value, and that whole construct I just described is supported by strong legal and regulatory regimes. Usually this is enforced by requirements for regular reporting and disclosures, which mostly happen retroactively. That model has hundreds of years of history and works pretty well. I would say at least works better than most DAOs, if we want to use that as a point of reference. But it has some important failure modes, and there are notable important examples of when this has really failed. The first kind of weakness of that corporate base case is short-termism. So you tend to see a prioritization of short-term share price over long-term business value. Governance decisions in that model get made by the largest financial interests only, and other stakeholders like users or customers don't have any voice in that system, or they have a very reduced voice. Sometimes we also see that capital allocation decisions get made in a way that enriches management in the short term and can come at the expense of shareholders or other stakeholders in the long term. And that can look like bad M&A, which we also call empire building, misuse of the treasury, or just straight funneling profits back to themselves in the form of inflated comp plans. And there are many prominent examples of that. Which leads me to the second big weakness of this model, which is accountability. And so there are many instances where the board, as the primary or singular mechanism to hold management accountable, fails at doing that. And there are many reasons for that, and there are many examples. In our research on this topic, we interviewed a lot of corporate governance experts and academics, and my favorite quote from all the interviews we did was that the effing board is the biggest shit show in corporate governance we've ever seen. So the board is necessary, and it does fulfill an important function, but it's insufficient as kind of the primary or only mechanism for accountability. So what's the diff? If we take that as the base case, what are the changes that we think would be important to make in Web3? Or how can we improve upon this model? There are like three big ones that I'm going to outline. The first one is what we call at Optimism stakeholder voting. And this is a core concept that has always kind of underpinned the original design of our governance system. And basically, it is a technique or a mechanism that can reduce short-termism by ensuring decisions aren't made only by the largest financial interests, but also include the interests of, in our case, users, which includes chains, apps, and the actual end user. So financial interests are still represented because they're still important, but they're not the only interests that make decisions. The second concept is a concept from Elinor Ostrom's Governing the Commons, which is graduated sanctions. And so if you look up here, this is the full list of what we think optimism governance proposals types should be. And the ones highlighted in blue have like a direct corollary in the corporate governance base case. And then the other ones are additional proposal rights we think should exist. And we think they should exist to enable the two value propositions I outlined, so reducing platform risk for the OP stack and preventing enshittification of the OP treasury, and then also to increase accountability. if a proposal type doesn't accomplish one of those things, we think that it shouldn't be in the governance surface area, which is a pretty big difference from what we see at most other DAOs, where they vote on many more things than what is outlined here, but it's hard to tie those proposal rights to a concrete value proposition or improvement that it's making over the corporate governance base case. And then the last but really important difference is on-chain authority. So off-chain governance, or relative to off-chain governance, on-chain governance can ensure management, quote, can't be evil. And so off-chain governance kind of works via regular reporting, oversight over the disclosures that are required. On-chain governance can allow corrective action to be taken in real time. And what that looks like is the ability to slash or remove representatives, the ability to veto protocol upgrades or treasury transfers before they occur, the ability to amend on-chain parameters, and the ability to verify execution rather than audit disclosures. And authority means I can actually stop the action as a governance participant. So what I just outlined does not look like what we traditionally think of as a DAO, and it also doesn't look like what we traditionally think of as a corporation. I'm taking suggestions for new terms that we can use because DAO now has a very specific connotation that I think we want to move away from. But it's some hybrid organizational structure in the middle that allows the business to move with sufficient speed, have low enshittification and platform risk, and have sufficient actual accountability. So this is not as sexy as we originally thought DAOs were going to be, but it's still really important. I don't know what's happening with my... Okay, it's still really important, and I think it's similar to the way DeFi kind of evolved, where DeFi evolved to emulate many of the characteristics and structures of the traditional financial system with one simple but really important difference, which is it's all transparent. And if you went to TradFi 10 years ago and said, just open source it, it's impossible for us to arrive at the endpoint that way. And so I think a similar thing will happen via DAOs, and organizational structures, where they will evolve to emulate many of the characteristics and structures of traditional corporate governance with a really important difference, which is accountability. So DAOs are not dead. They're just going to look different than we have historically thought of them. And we think that this long history of corporate governance can help us understand how they might function better. You can participate in Optimism governance by going to vote.optimism.io, and I'm on Twitter at @LalaLavender.